Awaken the ancient machineries because it looks like the Necrons are striding into 10th edition. We've got new and reimagined reanimation protocols, Gauss auto wounding on 6s to hit, and a Doomsday cannon that looks actually pretty lethal now. Let's talk about Necrons in 10th. Hello and welcome back to Warspets Tactics, where today we're talking Necrons, and Games Workshop has been keeping the faction previews for 10th edition coming reliably and steadily, it would seem. Again, as with the rest of them, it's been a fairly generous preview showcasing multiple faction rules, multiple datasheets and plenty of weapon profiles, so let's take a look at what we've got. First up, here's a quick summary of the reveals from the Games Workshop's latest article. As suspected, Necron's main army-wide rule is a new version of Reanimation Protocols. It's massively simplified compared with the previous one, where you had a bit of a weird system rolling dice per wounds lost to immediately get back up, and it's kind of more akin with the old Living Metal rule, just regenerating wounds to your squad each turn, but now more of them. It's revealed that the launch detachment is now called the Awakened Dynasty Detachment. This one appears to really focus around Necron characters leading their squads. Command protocols are a nice simple damage boost for leaders in squads now, and it's implied that you might have a second effect that they haven't yet previewed yet, something about helping units with battle shock tests. Then we've got a trio of further rules, the Doomsday Cannon's new profile with some genuinely dangerous damage, the Spear of the Void Dragon to see what that Catan can do in combat, and the Hungry Void stratagem, making Necrons a little bit more fearsome in melee. Then we've got two datasheet previews, both of which look pretty interesting to be honest. The Monolith looks like a really quite well-rounded and fairly indomitable Titanic unit, and the Necron Warriors might not be quite as overwhelming in terms of damage, but their reanimation protocols do look kinda demoralising to play against. Beyond that, there wasn't a huge amount in the free text. They did mention that a few units increased in toughness, Canoptek Doomstalkers, Triarch Stalkers, Canoptek Spiders, and Ghost Arks. Maybe that's not too hard to predict though, given that they're stretching the toughness system and tough stuff generally got tougher all around. Let's break that down bit by bit though, and we'll start out with the new reanimation protocols, perhaps the biggest news of the updates. I feel like each edition they have another go at getting reanimation protocols right. The last iteration of the rule was a surprisingly complex one that I saw misplayed quite a lot. You rolled a dice per wound that you'd taken. Try and roll as many 5+s as possible, and in that single dice roll, if you do manage to regenerate enough wounds to stand a model back up, it returns to the unit. It was basically a rule that really favoured one wound models, but meant that you were kind of unlikely to reanimate things like destroyers, though I guess it did combine with Living Metal, the one for just healing a wound each turn, which did help out a bit more on tougher stuff. Now though, basically it looks like they've merged and simplified those two rules. Reanimation protocols and Living Metal are all just made up of regenerating D3 wounds into your unit at the end of each of your command phases. If your unit's a single model unit, that'll just be regenerating wounds towards its max health. If it's a multi-model unit, then you basically heal up any damaged models, and then you start to regenerate models after that. Say if you had one wound worth of reanimation left, you'd set up, say, a multi-wound model with one wound left, and then continue to regenerate that next turn. It seems pretty simple and intuitive to be honest, and perhaps a lot more fair across the board. Looks like it's going to be a rule that works well on vehicles, wraiths and destroyers, and individual warriors. Quite a lot of value restored to the table each time you heal. Overall, I think it's quite a well-designed rule. It's really going to punish your opponent for not being able to fully wipe out squads. Anything that stays on the board is basically going to slowly regenerate towards full health again, and it means that random chip damage taken early on in the game might basically count for nothing unless your opponent can double down on it in a future turn. If you were doing this and healing with multiple different units every turn, then it will be a lot of points restored to the board. And as before, with regenerated models setting back up again, the positioning where you place those models could be very helpful indeed. Say if you're trying to make a charge later in the turn, putting them at the front of your unit, and you might be decreasing the charge distance. It is basically a flatly improved rule for anything that had the old Living Metal as well that was a single model unit. Necron vehicles and things will now be regenerating D3 wounds a turn rather than one, and that is pretty nice. Overall, I think it looks good, pretty easy to read and understand, and a very meaningful mechanic to have in the game. Next up, and perhaps a little bit more of a surprising rule, is the reworked version of Command Protocols. This one's going to be the detachment-specific special rule for the Necron Awakened Legion formation. This one looks like the detachment that you're going to be getting for Necrons right from the start of 10th edition, though it does look like they're an army that's going to be getting their codex early, so hopefully a bunch of other detachments should follow this up in short order. As I mentioned briefly earlier, they did also imply that command protocols would help you out with battle shock somehow. I'd guess there might well be a second part to this command protocols thing, unless it's literally baked into each Necron leader datasheet. As we'll see from the datasheets in a second, their leadership is actually surprisingly bad for what I'd guess Necrons to be. In any case, command protocols really seems nice and simple again. If your Necron squad is led by a leader unit, that squad then gets a +1 to its hit roll whenever it's making attacks. It's definitely a pretty powerful rule, maybe keeps the same sort of spirit as My Will Be Done from the previous incarnation of them. If your units are hitting on a 3+, that'll be a 25% damage boost most of the time. Realistically, maybe a little bit less, seeing as it wouldn't really improve the lethal hits from Gauss. And if you're hitting on a 4+, in theory it'll be a 33% damage boost. It does appear that Necron Warriors are going to be hitting on a 4+ now, not a 3. Overall, I think it's kind of interesting that they're basically locking the detachment specific rule to be something that's just really focused on squads led by leaders, which certainly isn't going to be every single unit in your army. It won't affect things like vehicles, and I'm sure there's plenty of squads that you just won't really want to buy in a leader for, maybe small things that don't justify that sort of level of support. If we do get a bunch of different Necron detachments, then this one's going to make any leader units just super valuable, as they'll be flat better. Say for example, if we did have a different Necron detachment where their main buff doesn't come from leaders, I think it is worth bearing in mind that the leaders will probably do something that justifies their points cost anyway. I'm sure we'll get things like Technomancers healing units, and Chronomancers improving defense in some way. It'll be interesting to see what the Lords and Overlords do as well. Unless just the base datasheet rules are just vastly more powerful than this, I guess it would mean that Necron armies are kind of likely to build around a fair few leaders leading some big chunky units to make good value out of them, and get their +1 to hit over as much good stuff as possible. It does maybe seem a little bit more rigid than some faction bonuses that we've seen so far. I guess it's hard to interpret until we've seen the full rules. Next up, and certainly on the wish list of a whole load of Necron players out there, is an upgraded profile for the Doomsday Ark. I feel like since the 9th edition Necron Codex dropped, this has been the gun that people have most been focused on wanting a buff for it. Its damage output isn't actually truly terrible, but it was just ridiculously swingy with the d6 shots and then d6 damage, plus it was annoying just how static it had to be even to achieve that, as its damage output got kind of terrible when it was on the move. Now though, it looks like the Doomsday Ark is basically flatly improved on just about every level. It gets d6+1 shots rather than d6, and with a blast keyword so it might get more. It gets that new heavy keyword so it gets to hit on a 2+ when it's stationary. The damage output still doesn't get terribly awful when you get it on the move though. It'll still be hitting at strength 15 and damage 4, which even if you don't get the +1 to hit, still means that it can be worth positioning. The flat damage 4 is an improvement over damage d6 I think, more average damage and more reliability, particularly if you're targeting things like 3 wound or 4 wound infantry. The strength has been increased to strength 15, kind of feels equivalent to the old strength 10 maybe. It'll still be wounding just about every vehicle on the game on a 3+, and then to cap it all off as if that weren't enough for you, and it also gets devastating wounds as well as what looks like its unit ability. If it stays stationary, then wound rolls of a 6 will cause mortals instead of its regular damage. That does look like it could be pretty useful to be honest, either against hordes to cause some more splash damage, or just against big units with invuls. Overall, between that little lot, there's not really anything that's really going to want to get hit by that. You average about 2 dead Terminators with those mortals, about 10 wounds to a Rhino or Repulsor. That really is pretty fearsome compared with a lot of big anti-tank weapons we've seen so far. Or around about 8 or 9 wounds to a Land Raider, again the devastating wounds helping out a bit. Overall looks suitably fearsome, looks like it's finally living up to its name. I wouldn't be too surprised though if this gets a fairly hefty points cost to reflect that. Next up we get a Catan weapon profile, and this one is the Spear of the Void Dragon, everyone's favourite anti-vehicle eldritch horror. As with a lot of strong combat weapons, it either has the choice between a sweep and strike mode. The sweep mode gets you 10 attacks hitting on 3s at strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2. The strike mode gets you 5 attacks hitting on 2s at strength 12, AP 3 and a big damage d6+2, and it also picks up that anti-vehicle 2+ rule, meaning that it's just going to be absolutely lethal to tanks. Against vehicles, you average about 15 wounds to just about anything with a 3+ save, or around about 12 to 13 wounds to vehicles with a 2+. He is still going to be at least somewhat threatening against infantry as well, kills 5 termagants or 3 intercessors, though he definitely wants to be catching up with vehicles if he possibly can. Will be interesting to see how they realise Catan in this new version. I wouldn't be too surprised if the damage cap mechanic has probably gone away. I feel like that might be a relic of 9th edition that a lot of people are glad to see the back of. Next up, we've got a rather fun stratagem for the Awakened Legion. This one's kind of interesting, as it's reinterpreting one of the previous command protocols, the Protocol of the Hungry Void. It's a 1 command point stratagem and still improves melee, giving you +1 strength and also an extra AP -1 if there is a character leading the unit. Fairly simple and straightforward, that one. You can make the calculation whether or not you think it's worth it whenever one of your Necron units fights. I'd say overall, as it goes, for 10th edition command points, this one maybe doesn't seem particularly stand out. I feel like the extra pip of strength might be just a little bit less important now the toughness system has stretched so much further. Against tough stuff, you're probably going to be a bit less likely to be wounding on something meaningful. It's going to be most useful on things where it makes the difference of the wound roll and also gives you extra AP. I think on paper it's generally going to be best on things like flayed ones or wraiths, units that have a whole bunch of low or mid strength attacks and maybe not amazing AP if they're being led by a character. Kind of interesting that this one also has a character focus buff as well. Seems they're really not messing around with incentivizing you to double down on leaders in your units. Looks like the Awakened Legion is generally going to be a bunch of nobles leading your Necrons about. Finally, we've also got ourselves a couple of datasheets as well. First up, and kind of useful to see, is the new profile for the Necron Warriors. Many aspects of them are having stayed fairly similar, but the differences are interesting. Defense-wise, they're more or less the same, toughness 4 and a 4+ save, and boosted reanimation protocols as we'll get onto. It is a bit weird to see that their leadership characteristic is only a 7+ for the unit, which is definitely a fair bit less than I would have guessed for Necrons. They've had super high leadership basically since they've come out. I kind of wonder if they might be going for a similar sort of thing with Tyranids and their Synapse type rule. Perhaps there's going to be a rule where if you've got leaders in the units, their leadership gets far better. For their guns, and maybe really not too surprising, the Gauss rule has become lethal hits. I feel like that's very on point with the Gauss weapons, to be honest. They have a reputation for being able to gradually flay away even the toughest stuff in the game. I feel like lethal hits is really quite lore appropriate there. Auto wounding on 6s will be nice. It does look like the weapons have had a bit of a side grade though to compensate. Both of them have lost a pip of AP. The Gauss Reaper's just AP -1 now, and the Gauss Flayer's AP 0. Otherwise fairly similar, barring the Gauss Reaper having lost the assault keyword, so you can't advance and shoot anymore. That is quite a big change, to be honest. That will drastically reduce their threat range and maybe bring a bit more balance between the guns. I still feel based on this though, the Gauss Reaper is probably going to be the way to go. At least having some AP and Strength 5 are both really quite big things. It is kind of interesting just how much they're handing out lethal hits in 10th edition so far. Just about every army's had some pretty easy access to it. Vehicles and monsters might not be the hardest to take down with small arms if this is the way they're going. The weapons have had a second nerf as well, as they only hit on a ballistic skill 4+ now. Previously they hit on 3s. With the command protocols, I guess that's doubly incentive to have some sort of leader in the units to get them to hit on a better ballistic skill. At least if they're mainly there for doing some damage and are actually fighting on the battle line, as opposed to just being minimum investment, tough and cheap. Talking of which though, I do think that the single best thing about the Necron Warrior datasheets is their datasheet specific special rule, which is a buff to reanimation protocols. Their number as Legion means that they get drastically improved reanimation. When you activate reanimation protocols for them, they get to reanimate D6 wounds rather than D3, so that's usually going to be 3.5 rather than 2. And if they happen to be on an objective, which really isn't the hardest thing to achieve, it goes up to D3+3 wounds, an average of 5 Necron Warriors restored to the squad basically for free. I feel like those sort of numbers being restored is just not something the opponent can really afford to take. If they're on an objective, there's basically going to be no point doing chip damage to Necron Warriors. You either need to focus them with multiple different units at once and really try and wipe them, or just devote the firepower to other things. I think it could really mess with enemy target priority. It'll be interesting to see that with leader buffs, whether or not they're going to be strong enough to hold down the battle line and actually be worth advancing into the midfield. I feel like a big unit with some sort of durability buff from a character could be genuinely terrifying to try and remove. Each time the reanimation protocols trigger, you're in for a very good time. Finally, for our last unit preview, we have the mighty Monolith. And Games Workshop had repeatedly dropped the points cost of these things to the point where they were kind of okay in 9th, but this new datasheet, I must admit, does look really quite fearsome, and if it's pointed right, I think could genuinely see some competitive play. The Monolith has a 7-inch move and has gained Fly now. That is really quite helpful for manoeuvring the big thing around terrain. A slow move and a massive footprint can still give it issues, but much less so than before if it doesn't matter about clipping through ruins a bit. Statline wise, it's now the single toughest thing that we've seen so far in 10th edition 40k. A massive great big toughness 14, a save of 2+, and 20 wounds should make it hard to take down. Looks like even things like most las cannons are going to be wounding this on a 5+, as opposed to the 3+ that it was before. Again, only having leadership 7 is kinda surprising to be honest. Unless there's some other way of getting this better battle shock, it's going to be failing tests surprisingly easily once it is bracketed. I guess that could be an issue if it does get damaged and it's somewhere in the centre board. Provided it's not getting battle shocks though, it's got a massive OC of 8, that's one of the best that we've seen for a while, and it's kind of interesting that this degrades when it's taken a certain amount of wounds as well. Once it's down to 7 wounds or less, it becomes OC 4 rather than 8. I guess that's probably something that we're going to see on other big super heavies as well. Wouldn't be too surprised if the Titanic Imperial Knights get that. Range damage wise as well, it does still look pretty impressive too. Its Particle Whip has lost a little bit of AP but now gets 3d6 shots, so that's an average of 10 or 11 shots right there, all at strength 8, AP -1 and damage 2, and perhaps the scariest thing is that it gets devastating wounds. With that many shots you are odds on to get at least 1/6 out of that. Should be able to punch some mortals through on its target at least fairly consistently. That's then backed up by the Flux Arcs or the Death Rays on the corners. The Flux Arcs give you some strength 6 and AP -1 Gauss. I suspect that the Death Rays are going to be where it's at though, unless they cost a significant amount more of points. These ones get a single shot at strength 12, AP 4 and damage d6 +1, so a really quite fearsome anti-tank punch there. But kind of weirdly they get sustained hits d3 on top of that, so every 6 that you get with this thing to hit basically becomes d3 +1 hits. Very nasty on that kind of profile. The Portal of Exile remains surprisingly potent for giant floating space pyramids in melee, a bunch of attacks hitting on 2s at damage 3, and then finally its special rule is the Eternity Gate. This one very much resurrects the special rules of the Monolith when Necrons were first introduced into Warhammer 40k. Each turn in the reinforcements phase, you get to select one Necron's infantry unit, either in reserves or on the board, and basically teleport that unit to somewhere within 6 inches of the Monolith, provided they're not in engagement range of any enemy models. You're not allowed to declare a charge in the same turn, otherwise I suppose you'd be getting some very short charges off, but it could be a really interesting way to shunt a bunch of Necron Warriors or something onto an objective, or just get some really close range guns in range of the enemy very easily, or even just rescue a friendly Necron unit nearby from being in melee, get to teleport them across the board, and still get to fire their guns as they haven't had counters falling back. It does look like a seriously handy ability to have on the board, and might be quite powerful if Necrons are going to be running around with a lot of really big blocky units. Obviously points are going to be kinda key with the Monolith. It's got loads of good abilities, but if they point it too high it's still not going to be great. I feel like this is the kind of datasheet though that really does have some interesting stuff on it. It definitely has potential and is worth a look at when the points come out. Overall, it's another solid faction preview from Games Workshop. I think it's really quite nice that they're giving us a good in-depth look at each of the factions in the game. I'd say most of the stuff for the Necrons does seem pretty encouraging. I think Reanimation Protocols is a nicely written rule, and that should be pretty powerful and interesting to play with. Nice to see the Doomsday Ark looking generally dangerous, and I feel like both the Monolith and the Necron Warriors are looking fun and interesting, with that teleporting rule and the Warriors' very big reanimation. I feel like the Awakened Legion is going to be interesting to see how that works in practice. From this preview it really looks like it might be trying to shoehorn you into taking big squads of infantry backed up by leaders. Definitely sounds like it'd be a fun way to play Necrons, but maybe not quite as balanced as I might have expected for a launch formation. Let me know your thoughts though. What things do you like about this, and what things do you dislike? If you've enjoyed the video then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, where I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I'm pretty certain that we'll have some more for the Necrons in the future. I might do a bit more of a focused look at either the Monolith or the Warriors if I get a chance. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked down in the video description if you'd like to help keep these videos coming. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.